Well, the old way was to have all the planning done. We had a site secured. There's a new way now. When President Nelson became the prophet, I was the executive director of the Temple Department. It was a very exciting period of time. And at the end of the presentation, he looked at me and he said, "Larry, I would feel better about your plan if there were another zero behind that number of the total temples." He's talking about 600, not 60.
Just get out your popcorn. Where's it going to be?
I was having some heart arrhythmia problem, and a message comes through on my cell phone. It's coming from an 801 number that I don't recognize. The message says, "Dear Larry, I put your name on the Thursday prayer roll. We extend our love to you for a quick recovery." And it's signed, Russ. Is this who I think it's from? How on earth? I was assigned with then Elder Nelson to reorganize a stake in Southern California, participated in the interviews with him, and I thought, oh, great, we're done. Then he said something that I never heard from anyone prior or following that experience.
You had a front row seat. You were right there at the Temple Committee when President Nelson, it sounds like you started around the same time with President Nelson, am I right?
So I'd been in the Temple Department for several years before he became the prophet, but I was the executive director of the Temple Department for 3 years. And the last year and a half of that was when President Nelson became the prophet. And it was a very exciting period of time. And there was so much that happened in that 18 months.
Can you describe what those early days felt like? Just that change, it switched, boom, he's in the temple at the very first press conference, and then you meet with him. What were those early days? How would you describe what those early days felt like?
Let me just give you a little bit background on this. So when my wife and I came back from Hong Kong, having served in the Asia area presidency in 2014, I was assigned to the Temple Department. In 2016, I became the executive director of the Temple Department. When I came back, Elder Quentin Cook, was the executive director of the council that oversees the temple and family history departments. And he created a temple planning committee, which the church had not had previously. They had a somewhat informal process for determining where they would build temples. And at that time, President Monson hadn't announced any new temples for a few years. Elder Cook wanted me to serve on that committee. I was in there with 2 other general authorities and Bishop Davies. We developed a plan, presented it to President Monson. It was accepted. We were quite proud of it. It was a 15-year plan. President Monson wanted to proceed at a pace of about 4 to 5 temples per year. And so based upon that plan, he announced the first temples that he had announced in a few years, I think it was 2014. And so anyway, President Nelson becomes the prophet. We think we need to present to him the 15-year plan, which we're quite proud of and which had been well received by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And he becomes the prophet in January of 2018. We presented that plan to him within the first 30 days. We're in the conference room, which the First Presidency uses off of his office. Present our wonderful plan. He's listening carefully, taking it all in. And based on 4 or 5 temples a year, for over 15 years, you get to about 60 temples for the whole plan. And I was the one who was making the presentation to him. At the end of the presentation, he looked at me and he said, "Larry, I would feel better about your plan if there were another zero behind that number of the total temples that you have in it." And my mind is racing when he says that. And I'm thinking, did I just hear that correctly? And I'm saying to myself, he's talking about 600, not 60.
So you had 60.
We had 60, and he is saying, I want another zero after that number. And I'm thinking, does he really mean that? Or does he just say, you need to up it a little more? Well, obviously, he really meant it. And in that moment, I think I saw the first sign of where he was headed with temple building. And from there, it was off to the races. So we redid the plan, and I'm sure it's been redone a few times since then to catch up with his vision. And it greatly expanded what had been considered to be the going forward plan for future temple building.
what was that like in those circumstances? Because it almost seems as if he'd been inspired for this to be such a big focus. Did he seem antsy? Did he seem almost like it's got to be at a zero?
President Nelson says often that good information precedes good revelation. And so he wants the best information you can provide. We explained the computerized tool that we had developed to be able to come up with this 15-year plan, the variables that we'd incorporated into it in terms of the membership of the church, tithing, faithfulness, growth of the church, distance to a temple, cost to get to a temple, various other variables, how we'd weighted them. He's taking it all in. We make the presentation showing him year by year, here's the priorities that we have come up with using these variables, weighting them as described. And so these would be the next 60 temples we would build. He listens to the whole thing. He's just trying to understand what's there, how we got there. And after we've finished the presentation, so he doesn't really say anything that signals where he's headed until we're done. And I finish that presentation and he says, there needs to be another zero after the total.
Wow. So I'm understanding you're saying that it's almost as if the revelation perhaps even hit him in that moment once he got that information.
It may have. But we walked out of that room and we said, okay, obviously we're far off the mark that he has in mind. And so back to the drawing boards we go, and we redid the plan and expanded it substantially. And as we brought things forward, he immediately began announcing larger numbers of temples than had been done prior to that time. And of course, it continued until we got to 20 temples, or I don't know if there's been a conference where there were more than 20 temples announced. Perhaps there was. But he definitely had in mind another zero, 600.
Wow. And how many are we at right now?
So he announced 200 temples. We are around 400 in terms of those that are operating or that have been announced and are in either construction or planning.
I'll never forget. I was in my house and he announced Tallahassee, Florida. I'll never forget. I never would have thought that there would ever be a temple in Tallahassee, Florida. Is there any background or any reasoning behind the reason why it where the locations would be and how they would do that? Are you able to comment on anything about that?
There is, and there are a lot of variables that get considered. So we put the numbers into the computer model, but once they come out, we take into consideration other things too. So sometimes there are borders that people can't cross. For example, the members of the church in Haiti share an island with the Dominican Republic where there is a temple, but they can't get to that temple because there's a border and they are not permitted to cross it. And so we said, all right, where do we have situations like that? And places like that were weighted more favorably and went towards the top of the list. So when President Monson announced the first three temples after a several-year hiatus, the first three were Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Côte d'Ivoire, and Bangkok, Thailand.
Did he ever announce any that you didn't know of, and he just in the moment was just like, that's and another one? Was there ever anything like that?
There was. So we had Russia on the list, a temple somewhere in Russia, but we didn't have a specific location, and it was far down the list. President Nelson said during one conference, when we brought in the 6 or 8 or 10 temples, I forget the number, for consideration to be announced at conference, he said, we need to add Russia to the list. And so we did. Now, things are very difficult in Russia for the church right now, and I don't know when the church will be able to build a temple there, but they continue to look for opportunities, and I'm confident we'll pursue those opportunities until we do have a temple in Russia. And he wanted, I think, to make sure the Russian saints knew that a temple is on the way as soon as we're permitted to build one.
That's so beautiful. It's almost as if there's a declaration and then the details come afterwards is what I'm understanding.
Right.
And I think that I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I almost thought that they had most of the planning and set before they would announce them. But now it's almost like there's declaring it's going to be there. Then they figure out the detail. That's really powerful, actually. It reminds me of First Nephi chapter 1. I don't know how they're going to get the plates, but we're going to get the plates,
Well, the old way was to have all the planning done. So the old way was we had a site secured, we had the approvals to be able to proceed to build on that site, and we wouldn't announce until those things were in place. There's a new way now.
This is so powerful. What was the atmosphere like that you would say in the room working together on these temples? What was it like there?
Well, it was electric with the revelatory feeling that a prophet recognized that we are approaching a millennial day. Don't know exactly when that will be, but there's some things that need to be in place. And a lot more temples is one of them. And that is one of his great legacies.
It really is. It really is. It's almost like every time we would have those experiences, somebody, just get out your popcorn. Where's it going to be?
Right.
And you were sitting there in the room presenting to President Nelson. What were your thoughts afterwards, after having that experience? What were some of the things that went through your mind?
Well, I think a recognition that there was a prophet in the land and that he was moving the church in a different direction. When he told me that there ought to be another 0 after the number we had in the 15-year plan, I did not realize that he would live to announce 200 temples. That just seemed, looking back, I mean, I had no idea that was coming, that it would be of that magnitude. And yet that's what did happen.
I just remember him being in the temple, the chapel adjacent to the temple. And he said, we want to begin with the end in mind. And he's sitting there with the first presidency with President Oaks, President Eyring. And he really meant it, didn't he?
He did.
What would you say? What were your experiences like with him? How did he approach leadership in those committee settings?
Well, he was very consultative. And I heard President Ballard, who was constantly encouraging us to use councils effectively, to counsel with our councils was his phrase, and get everybody involved in that counseling process. President Ballard often talked about President Nelson being one of the most consultative leaders he had ever seen. And he really valued and appreciated what he did. And I saw that. I remember we brought a policy matter before the first presidency. There had been a policy which said that sisters who had dependent children at home could not serve as temple workers. And we raised the question with the first presidency of whether that ought to be reconsidered. They decided to look at the pros and cons of that. And we brought it forward in the meeting of the first presidency to discuss with them and presented a recommendation that we change that policy and no longer have a limitation on sisters. They could judge for themselves if their circumstances permitted, even if they had dependent children, their circumstances permitted them to serve as temple workers. Sister Joy Jones, who was the general primary president, was in the meeting with us. And when we had the discussion, he turned to Sister Jones and said, "Joy, what do you think?" And she said, "Well, I was in this situation and I had dependent children who are still at home, but they were in school. And I was in a position where I could have served in the temple during the time of day when they were in school. And I was disappointed that I couldn't. And I would support changing the policy." And President Nelson took that feedback and they had a brief discussion with the first presidency and decided it was time to change that policy. So very consultative in his approach. I'll tell you what it was like to work with him. The first experience I had was 25 years ago when I was serving as an Area 70 in California. And I was assigned with then Elder Nelson to reorganize a stake in Southern California. We completed the interviews on a Saturday morning. It took us, I think, 3 or 4 hours to complete the 25 interviews. And then he said, let's go for a walk. I want to take a break. We've been sitting for a long time. I'd been with other general authorities who'd done the same thing, said the same thing, let's go for a walk. And that had usually meant 1 or 2 laps around the building. Well, Elder Nelson proceeded to cross the street, go into an adjacent neighborhood, and we walked at a very brisk pace for the next 45 minutes. There was no 1 or 2 laps around the building. Got back to the meeting house. I was perspiring. It was a warm day in Southern California. And I thought, boy, when President Nelson invites you to go for a walk, you better have good walking shoes on and be prepared to go for a while.
Wow.
But then we got back, and it was very interesting to participate in the interviews with him. He was very interested in each individual and conveyed that personal interest and love to them in ways that were palpable. And then as we began praying about whom to call, whom the Lord wanted to have serve as the new stake president, we finished praying, and he turned to me and he said, "Who's on your short list?" We had a brief little biographical sketch and a picture of each individual we'd interviewed. And so he spread those out on the table. He said, "Put together your short list." So I pulled out 4 or 5 names and said, "These are the 4 or 5 that I think include the future stake president." He looked at it and he said, "That's right." He said, "Who's the new stake president?" And I said, "I think it's this one." And I moved a piece of paper up to the top of the desk. He said, "That's it. That's right." And I thought, oh, great, we're done. We've had the revelatory experience. We agree. Then he said something that I never heard from anyone prior or following that experience. He said, "Who's the first counselor?" And I thought, we're here to call a stake president. What do you mean, who's the first counselor? And I thought, well, I'm supposed to know who the first counselor is? Nobody told me that. And so I was thinking and trying to get on the same, in the same wavelength. And I said, "I think it's this brother." And he said, "Very good. That's the first counselor." And then he said, "Who's the second counselor?" And I thought, what are my chances I'm going to get this one right too? Can't we just stop now while I'm ahead? And I said, "I think this brother is the second counselor." He said, "You got it." He said, "That's the new presidency right there." Then we called the new stake president. He turned to him and he said, "You can call anyone you want as a counselor. We need to approve it. You recommend it, but you can call anyone you want." He didn't offer any observations. He didn't try to lead the witness. He didn't suggest the names of the 2 brothers that he told me were the 2 counselors based upon what I thought. And the stake president went off to pray for 15 or 20 minutes and think about it and came back. And he recommended the first counselor and second counselor exactly as President Nelson had expected they would be. And I thought, okay,
Wow.
This man not only sees what's happening with the president, he sees what's happening with the whole presidency. He's got a revelatory gift that goes beyond what most have.
That's so powerful. What did that mean for you to be able to be a witness, to be able to receive it? Because you received the revelation as well. What was that like for you?
Well, it definitely was a confidence booster, I would say, because as an Area 70, you are the junior companion, and you never feel more junior than when you're with a member of the 12, and you're a little nervous and anxious about it and wondering if you're going to be up to the task. And so to have that happen was certainly reassuring to me that, okay, maybe I'm able to do this in the right way. And he was just so gracious and so warm. And when we were talking, as we walked through the neighborhood, he was mainly peppering me with questions about me and my family and what was going on with my work and various things about my past and the experiences I'd had. So it was a remarkable experience to be with him and just see how personally engaging he was.
What do you think he was wanting you to understand? It almost seems like he was trying to teach you something because he didn't have to do that, you know?
Well, I think so President Nelson was not only a global leader of our faith, he had a personal ministry to people. And I think he looked at these Area 70s as maybe a potential future General Authority 70, and he wanted to nurture them and help them and prepare them and enable them to be prepared if another calling came in the future. And so he became a friend that weekend, and we were called to serve in the Quorum of the 70 another dozen years after that. And when we arrived in Salt Lake, we're coming from California. We have a few friends and a few relatives in Salt Lake, but we're really not connected to the world of Salt Lake. So we were feeling a bit like strangers in a strange land. And no one was more personally welcoming to us than President Nelson. Every time President Nelson saw me, he would say, "Hello, Larry Y." My middle initial is Y for Young. That's my mother's maiden name. And he would always call me Larry Y. And and then his next question was, "How's Linda? What's going on in your family?" But that first year we were there was no one at church headquarters who was more welcoming, who was kinder, who extended himself more to us than Elder Nelson did. And that was when he was still in the 12, before he became the president of the 12.
I can feel that means a lot to you.
Yeah.
That's very, very important.
And, it's so interesting to be around him. So you have opportunities to be at the lunch table with other general authorities who are there in the basement of the church administration building. I remember one day I was at lunch with President Nelson, and I said, I knew he was a big skier, and he was approaching 90 at this point. And so I asked him, "Have you been skiing lately?" He said, this was on a Tuesday. So usually the general authorities are off on Mondays, and you're working Tuesday through Friday in the office, and then Saturday and Sundays out on church assignment at state conferences and meetings of that type. I said, "So have you been skiing lately?" He said, "Not since yesterday." And I thought, wow,
Wow, 90.
old. I think he was 89 at the time, and he is still on the slopes. They finally persuaded him to stop when he became the president of the church, because they didn't want to have to announce that some crazy snowboarder ran over the president of the church and did him permanent harm on the ski slopes.
Wow.
So he finally agreed to give it up when he became the prophet.
So he lives what he teaches.
He does.
And the personal ministry, you've experienced that for you.
Well, let me tell you just another aspect of that personal ministry. And
Yeah.
I'll try to do this without getting too emotional. So I got to know President Nelson quite well, because the executive director of the Temple Department is really closely working with the First Presidency, and particularly with the president of the church. And so we've traveled together to temple dedications in Concepcion, Chile, and Sapporo, Japan, and Rome, Italy, and various other places. In fact, I remember being in the meeting of the First Presidency when we were talking about plans for the Rome temple dedication. And he said, "I want to take the whole First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12. And I thought, well, maybe he's just a little over enthusiastic, and that really won't happen. Is he serious? He's going to take all 15 apostles over to Rome for this, out of the country? Can they all be out of the country at the same time? And he did. And
which is unheard of. They never get all everybody together.
I think that's the first time it's ever happened in the history of the church, as far as I know. And there they were, all 15 of them, at the Rome temple dedication. But anyway, back to his personal ministry. I think he keeps track of people in ways that I may not have fully appreciated. I completed my service in 2019. We moved from Salt Lake to Virginia because we have two daughters who live here in the area, and we wanted to be close to grandchildren. This is where the largest number of our grandchildren were. So we moved back here. 2023, 4 years later, I was having some heart arrhythmia problems and was going through treatment for those. And the treatment when you have atrial fibrillation or preventricular contractions is what they call an ablation. They go into the heart with a catheter, and the one I had done had a frozen tip on the end of it, and they try to freeze tissue that they think is causing the arrhythmia to see if they can stop it. It works about 75 or 80% of the time. They did one of those on me in January of 2023. Didn't really prove effective. They tried again in March. Didn't prove effective. This is probably the best electrophysiologist in the Washington, D.C. metro area who's doing it. So it's no lack of expertise being applied. It's just it doesn't work in some people because the arrhythmia is probably deeper in the heart tissue. So I was going in for my third one in May, which is about as many as they want to attempt on someone before they say, well, I guess this isn't going to work. I'm getting ready to go into the hospital for my third one, and a message comes through on my cell phone. Let me read you the message. I have it up here on my iPad. It's coming from an 801 number that I don't recognize. There's no name attached to it, so it's not in my phone directory. The message says, "Dear Larry, I put your name on the Thursday prayer roll for the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 meeting. Please know that we extend our love to you for a quick recovery. Russ." I read that and I think I kind of had the same reaction that I did when he was adding a 0 to the number of temples in the temple plan. Is this who I think it's from? Am I really reading this? Is this from the president of the church who has the weight of the world on his shoulders and who at the time was in his mid-90s? No, he was in his late 90s. He would have been 98 in 2023 when he sent me that message. And I'm just thinking, how on earth does he even know that I'm dealing with a health issue? And then, however he found out, he had to go track down my cell phone number, and he personally sends me the message, and it's signed Russ. Now, you talk about a personal ministry. So he's reaching out to the world in his general conference addresses and in other ways, and has a global ministry, but he has a personal ministry, and he's paying attention to what's going on in the lives of people that he knows and reaching out in ways that reflect incredible loving kindness and concern.
He connected with you personally. That's so powerful, huh?
Yep.
That he wanted you to understand that.
Yeah. No, it's truly, truly remarkable to me.
No, those are really great. Those are very, very powerful, especially the one-to-one. Because I mean, how many people get a chance to have that? And I think that a lot of it too, though, connecting it to Jesus Christ, right? Him reaching to you through a prophet who is called to be his mouthpiece. Right. I can't imagine, because there's people that on the day-to-day, your mom, your brother, your sister, but someone who is called to be the mouthpiece of the Lord. I guess I'm really curious of what that means to you, coming from the prophet.
Well, I know I have a pretty good idea of what's on his plate because I spent time at church headquarters, and I know the mammoth responsibility that rests on the shoulders of the First Presidency. And even with all the help they have with the 12 and the 70 and the general officers of the auxiliaries and all the employees and everyone else who's involved, it's just almost an impossible task. And the idea that you reach out to an individual who's 4 years beyond his service at church headquarters, who's out of sight, out of mind, and just be easy to say, oh, well, and not only be aware of it, put the name on the prayer roll, but then to send a text message to let that individual know that he's aware of it and what he's doing. Remarkable. Yeah. Just remarkable.
You know, being a part of the temple, because just remind me, and I please forgive me for not having this perfectly correct. Your role, I'd like to get you a soundbite of you just stating your specific role within the church. because you worked as your full-time position, and then you also worked on the committee, correct? Can you explain that differentiation? Because I want to get more into what it means, like some of the covenants that we make in the temple, how it ties to Jesus Christ, and how you felt that he lived those laws that he was so adamant about.
So a general authority 70 usually has multiple assignments unless you're the executive director of a department. So when I was an assistant executive director in the temple department, I was serving in the Utah area presidency, for example, or I was serving on other committees. When you become the executive director, that is pretty all-consuming, and so that's a full-time job. And the last 3 years of my service, that's what I did. It was a unique opportunity because you worked very closely with first Elder Quentin Cook, then Elder David Bednar, who were the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles who have responsibility for the temple and family history work, or they did at that time. And you worked closely with the prophet and the first presidency. I'll just share one other anecdote with you from those meetings of the Temple Sites Committee, as it's called. It's called Temple Sites, but it actually deals with temple construction, temple design and decor, artwork, temple policies, changes in the temple ceremony, anything having to do with temples goes through that committee. At the end of the meetings, when all of the other business has been taken care of, the First Presidency reviews original artwork that has been prepared to go into temples. And they're usually anywhere from 10 to 15 pieces of art that are being evaluated by them for suitability to be placed in the temples. The artwork is all behind them against the wall where they're sitting. And so they turn their chairs around to face it. And President Nelson invited Sister Jones, General Primary President, to come sit next to him as the First Presidency was looking at the artwork. The rest of us stood behind them who were in the meeting. And so Sister Jones went up there with them, and they go through each piece of art to talk about which temple it will be placed in, who the artist was, talk a little bit about it. First Presidency, I think, approved everything that day. Occasionally something doesn't get approved, but everything was approved and went forward. And then President Nelson expressed his gratitude for all the great work that had been done. And he said, looking at this beautiful art, I just weep for joy. And then he turned to Sister Jones sitting next to him and said, maybe I should say, I weep with joy.
Because her name, that's powerful.
Okay.
Cool.
Maybe in his mid-90s, but he's sharp as a tack.
Hey, that's a good pun, little play on words. Yeah. What are some of those paintings like? I mean, because I've noticed the depiction of Christ. I know I live in Springville, so Provo City Center Temple. Mm-hmm. A lot of these temples, I mean, they do seem to have in almost every room a picture of Christ in it. How do they go about deciding those?
We tried to, we actually gave a lot of thought to this and changed some things when I was there. We made an effort to enhance and upgrade the artwork in the temples. I think it has happened in a remarkable way. And we thought about what artwork ought to go in various rooms of the temple. So, for example, in the baptistry, we want things that have to do with baptism, with priesthood authority, but we also would like to have something that bring in the youth, and so have a child or a young adult in a painting. And so we try to make that the focus of the artwork in the baptistry, and then the focus of the artwork would be different in other areas of the temple. In the bride's room, obviously, something suitable for a woman who's about to be married. In the initiatory area, we just had one painting that had been used everywhere, which was Moses and Aaron, and it had been used for decades. It was the only thing you ever saw in an initiatory area.
Yeah, I remember the one. I know the one.
And we thought it was maybe overused, and so we had some newer things done with Samuel ordaining David, anointing David, and some other things like that, which you now see in the initiatory areas. And I think caused people to step back and think, oh, yes, I know what that's referring to in the Bible, and to maybe not just walk past it because they've seen it so many hundreds of times that they no longer pay attention to it, but to stop and be affected by it. So there's definitely an effort to have more images of the Savior, more images of women in the temple, more images of people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds, and I think we've made great strides in the last almost decade with those objectives.
I've definitely noticed.
I'll just share another story. President Nelson's a remarkable musician. You've probably read the news accounts about how when he was singing in the high school choir, they would invite someone up from the audience to play a note on the piano, and he would proceed to tell them what note they had played because he has perfect pitch.
Wow, yeah.
And I noticed he would play the organ for the meetings of the general authorities in the temple that are held on the first Thursday of each month. He picked up that duty from President Kimball, who had done it prior to him. And I noticed that President Nelson, and then Elder Nelson, would be sitting at the organ bench. He'd have the hymn book open, but he didn't seem to be looking at it much. And he would just play one hymn and then another and another, but he wasn't turning any pages. And I realized, oh, he's either playing from memory or he's playing by ear. and he just had a remarkable gift. When I was involved with him in a regional conference in California, in Oakland, California, during some meetings on Sunday between the morning and afternoon, we went over to the temple president's residence, which was just across the street, for lunch. And he sat down at the piano and he proceeded to play for probably 30 or 45 minutes. He played some hymns, some light classical pieces, some Broadway show tunes, just all from memory. Just finish one, transition to the next, and keep going. It was quite remarkable. And had the same experience with him when we were involved in the Sapporo, Japan dedication. We had dinner at the mission president's home one night, and he sat down at the piano and he proceeded to play for 15 or 20 minutes and just went through a number of things, not a note of music in front of him, had it all stored away up here or could somehow pull it out of the air. I'm not sure how exactly the process works when you have that amazing gift, but he was a remarkable musician.
Well, it just doesn't stop. Well, and I know we have about 6 minutes. President Oaks, he's going to be the new president, most likely. I mean, just with the succession that we have, what have you observed about him, President Oaks?
Well, I was a stake president in California. We were hosting in our stake building a regional meeting of some type that Elder Oaks was coming to. And I was a little bit apprehensive because President Oaks is obviously a powerful intellect, and I knew about his legal background, and it can be a little intimidating. So I wasn't sure what to expect. Well, he arrived at our building, and we did whatever we needed to by way of preliminary preparation for the meeting. And then he said, I want to make sure I have at least 20 minutes of time in the chapel before the meeting begins. And I thought, okay, great. So we arranged to do that. When we went in there, you would have thought he was running for mayor of Danville, California. He was going around trying to meet and greet and connect with every person in that room. And just, he was walking from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And I thought, wow, he is so warm and personable. I didn't realize that. And I don't know how many members of the church have seen that side of him, because when you see church leaders as a talking head at general conference, sometimes you don't know what the personality is, and it doesn't come through clearly necessarily in the message. And I thought, this is a remarkable person who wants to connect with all these people one-on-one as much as he can before this meeting begins.
No, I think that you're right about that, without a doubt. When you only hear him in conference, and then you hear these stories about them, and you're like, yeah, no, they do have compassion. And I mean, he's a judge. I think that people make assumptions in that regard, right? As we conclude, I want to turn it back over to President Nelson. What would you say for you if when you look years back and you tell the stories of President Nelson, what you've learned about him, working with him on the temple committee, what will you tell your grandchildren?
Well, we had a prophet in the land, and he made some big changes in the church. Before he became the president of the church, I thought he was probably going to maintain the status quo. I had no idea that he would prove to be such a change agent. And he changed so many things. It was truly a time when the revelatory process was very apparent to me in what was happening in the church. And I thought it was reflected in the enormous undertaking of temple building on a scale and scope that we've never seen before. I mean, he's announced more temples than all of his predecessors combined. I thought it was reflected in the magnificent messages he gave. President Nelson loves language and loves words and loves trying to understand the inner meanings of words. That's how we got to let God prevail in your life. But think celestial. He had a way of coming up with phrases that were memorable and words that would stay with you. Be peacemakers. Just all the different, the time you spend in a temple will do more for you than most other things you could do to draw close to God and have a greater measure of holiness in your life. He talked a lot about the higher and holier way. We were going to do a higher and holier way of ministering, and completely changed how we do that in the church. He changed the way we meet on Sundays. That phrase, higher and holier, was attached to many things that he talked about. And I think there was just a general call to the membership of the church that we need to rise above the world and live on a higher and holier plane. We need to follow the Savior. We need to help people understand this is the church of Jesus Christ. And he certainly emphasized using the name appropriately, as well as many other things. So it was an exciting time. And I expect it will continue to be an exciting time. We've heard people talk the last 15 years, maybe, about the hastening of the work. And there was a lot of talk about it. And I was looking around thinking, okay, well, I'm not sure I'm seeing that much hastening. And now all of a sudden, we're going to be at 400 temples, and we've got 84,000 plus missionaries out there, more than we've ever had. We had over 300,000 convert baptisms last year, which is the most we've had in a few decades. And this year is 20% above that in every area of the world, as was shared, I think, by Elder Cook at the recent Mission President Seminar. So I sense that this hastening of the work is definitely going on, and President Nelson was encouraging us to prepare for the millennial day when the Savior returns. And there are some tough times mixed in there, but there are some great things mixed in there too. And it is an exciting time, and we've witnessed the miracle. I think it was Elder Rasband talked about the miracle happening before our eyes. Are we paying attention? Are we seeing what's happening? And it truly has been a miraculous time.
Well, thank you very much. It means so much to hear these stories. I never thought in my life that I would have this opportunity to have a conversation in such depth and in such intimacy with someone who's had such a close connection with the prophet and has spent so much time in the work of the Lord and the gathering.
Stephen, I admire and appreciate what you do. Thank you.